Welcome to Vision to Venture. I'm Eddie, and I'm here to uncover the realities of scaling and building a tech startup. Each week, I speak to leaders within the tech space with their insights and advice on how to found, fund, and frame a tech startup. So make sure to follow and subscribe to never miss an episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Vision to Venture. Today I am joined by Dean Aston, and with over a decade of experience in talent acquisition and HR, Dean has held pivotal roles in companies such as Google, ePlan Systems, and Babylon Health. Hey Dean,
hey,
how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good, I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming down and joining me on Vision to Venture. So just to start off, with an easy one, warm ourselves up, I wanted to ask, why talent acquisition?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of like HR and talent people, you don't necessarily always plan to go into the profession. You kind of like fall into it, as you say.
You definitely fall into
it.
Right?
And literally like it's, 2009, I remember back then the financial economy was just in pieces, right?
Yeah.
And I'd essentially, like, after university, worked my way into a sales role. And I was looking online because I liked the element of, like, connecting with people. I've always been a relationship guy. All about the connections, right?
Yeah.
And then I applied for a role with a company called Huntress way back in the day. And I start essentially doing talent acquisition, focusing on recruiting user experience professionals.
Okay.
And I think the draw for me at the time was a couple of things. So I think one, it was the metrics-driven nature of the role, because it was that classic kind of paradigm of what you put in is what you get out. The more calls you do, the more connections you make, the more likely you are to achieve your targets, right?
Yeah.
But I think there was this kind of secondary dimension for me, which was like, getting on the phone and building credibility with people, where like the more you knew about your discipline and your topic, the more that people would engage and relate to you. So for me, I think like that was the start of, what's been a really exciting career so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a case of just consistently connecting and it is, I feel like, I don't know if it's the same for you, but when I fell into recruitment, it was a lot of people going, oh, you should do it, you've got the gift of the gab, you can talk to people, like you're chatty, and it's just like, just go and do that.
Right.
And that's exactly how it happened for me.
Yeah.
And it was a case of, I was in a hospitality job, I was just serving coffees to people, and I was like, I can do more than this. And it was just a case of people just chatting to any random customer coming in, and I was like, go into recruitment. Right. It's just talking to people. It's fine, it's easy, but it's not easy.
Oh, hell to the no. Oh, hell to the no. Literally, so I remember in that first role at Huntress, like, they would literally track the amount of time that you were on the phone. So literally, I'll be on the phone looking at the clock. On the phone looking at the clock. And, like, literally, the graft was so tough, but I think from an internal perspective, like that target-focused element is what creates a lot of that discipline that lasts you throughout your career.
Yeah.
But I think what I didn't appreciate at the time was how the role of talent acquisition really served as like an ambassador to the brand and the company that you were representing at the time, right? I was doing my new business calls and stuff like that, and I was thinking about, like, how am I going to set myself apart from other recruiters? And it was all about really understanding, like, what was the mission statement of the business?
Yeah.
What was it about their product that differentiated them from their competitors? And then being able to articulate that and tell that story to people was the bit that's where I found my energy, right?
No, absolutely. And so being in talent acquisition for obviously such a long time now, how would you say you approach talent acquisition and attract top tier talent in competitive sectors such as tech? And what would you say founders can do to make their startup more stand out for potential employees?
Ooh, I mean, this is the $1 million, £1 question, right? So I think first of all, let's break it down to the basics. So I think talent acquisition professionals, in and of themselves, sometimes have a bit of a hard rap, and that's because founders perhaps don't understand the nature and the power of the profession. And typically what you have is a founder that thinks, okay, I need to scale my business, so I'm going to call a recruiter, and it's purely a transactional understanding. But it's like, okay, when you actually go a bit deeper, that person, that recruiter, that role that represents the brand, an extension of the brand we call it, is first of all articulating your value proposition.
Yeah.
When we talk about managing things in the competitive landscape, right? An engineer ain't got time to be speaking to recruiters all the time. So you have to think about, okay, what is the type of problem that I'm solving that's going to get that engineer, product person, you name it, to respond and for that to resonate, right? And how am I going to brief this person to be able to articulate what it's like to work in this culture? Because first of all, I think post-COVID, the dynamics of recruiting has completely changed. The nature of the conversation is driven by, okay, flexibility in role, right? What's in it for me? It sounds crude, but that's the underlying reality. Like, what is it that a brand, a company says about themselves that, first of all, is consistent with the experience that people have right from the initial phone call from a recruiter through to the onboarding process, through to when they turn up, right? So I think, really, to answer your question, there are a number of dimensions that a founder needs to be mindful of. And I think having a credible, well-resourced talent acquisition team, trusted advisor person, delivering on those messages is ultimately what will make that 0.1% difference between if an engineer has role A, role B, they decide to go with role B. It is about how well you tell that story and how true it is when they join the business.
Yeah. And it's because there's so many different aspects, especially nowadays, that potential employees and candidates will look out for. It's not just what's the salary, what's the responsibilities.
No way.
It's gone way beyond that now. And it is a sale. It is a sale.
Absolutely.
And you need to make sure that, like you just said, actually follow up on those key points that they've put in their job advertisements to make sure that what they are saying their company actually is. Because it's so often that candidates will go through a process, they're really attractive points, turn up, and they're not actually there. This episode is sponsored by DS Group. DS Group help connect machine learning and software engineering talent with groundbreaking opportunities in the field of AI. So whether you're a company searching for exceptional tech talent or an individual seeking that perfect role, DS Group is your go-to solution. Thanks to DS Group for sponsoring Vision to Venture. And so, in your career, what would you say are some of the most common mistakes startups make regarding HR or people management that you have encountered?
There are so many. You know what it is? If you imagine, like, it's kind of like a laws of physics type challenge. Because on the one hand, right, like a founder, okay, they may have done their seed stage or their Series A. And it is all about speed and scale. Winning more market share, trying to get to profitability, trying to manage the cash and the burn rate. There are so many conflicting priorities. You know, you've got to look at your product roadmap to make sure that it's, you know, you got the customer fit, or at least you are winning in your market. So the time that it takes to really think through the people challenges really does require a founder to have a trusted advisor in that, with that people expertise beside them, who can help to articulate what the map looks like. Now, if I was saying, okay, what are the things that I would prioritize? I think one is be really clear about your mission statement. Easier said than done. And it needs to be more than just a statement. It needs to come to life. Now, how does it come to life? First of all, you be really clear about what are the values that drive your decision making.
Yeah.
This is the difference between like having a website with values written down versus something known as your operating principles. It's everything from how you hire, how you fire, right? Real talk.
It is.
Right?
It is. You're completely right.
Right? The blueprint, what are you testing for? Because
Yeah.
it's more than just, who can do a great job in a code test as part of an interview process. It's who naturally exhibits the values that really underpin how you want folks to work in the organization, right?
Yeah.
Now, culture is one thing, and really ultimately it's an expression of your values coming to life, right? But I think building on that, you've got to think about all of the infrastructure necessary to house these people once they join. Now, often founders make the mistake of 12 months, 24 months, 36 months down the road. Let's say, for example, they get to Series B, then they're thinking about, should we replace our HRIS system? Should we upgrade our recruitment ATS? And what I'd encourage, a piece of advice is think early about what systems investments you want to make. Think early about what is the employee life cycle and experience that you want people to have, right from when the person picks up the phone and you're selling the brand, to when you're going through the onboarding process, because that's one of the key touch points where people experience your brand for the first time, right? And making sure you're using data where you can to measure the levels of engagement across the conversation. Now, it's not a panacea, it's not the only way, but a CEO having a leadership team that can feed back what's happening on the ground, what's happening throughout the organization, and then being able to validate that with insights across their system. So if you use an engagement survey, for example, being able to identify trends early, and having an approach which is human-centric, right?
Yeah.
I think even the term HR is old school, right? I think when people are seeing themselves as customer-focused, customer-centric, your employees are ultimately your customers internally. That kind of paradigm and mindset is the one that will connect a founder to their people. Everyone will make mistakes, but it's about getting those insights where you can pivot quickly to address them and fix them.
Yeah. And so just following off that, what would you say, in your opinion, makes a great manager or makes a great leadership team?
Let's look at that from the macro perspective, first of all. So I think when you look at the scaling journey of a business that's successful, let's say they've successfully got through seed, they've gone through Series A, they've gone through Series B, let's say they're at Series C, right? The challenges that come with a workforce of 100 people suddenly become exponentially more complicated when you get to 500 people.
Yeah.
Right? Now, managers sometimes get a lot of stick and a bad rap, right? Because what typically happens is in the smaller version of the company, you have a manager who perhaps was an individual contributor earlier on in their time. They get promoted because they're doing a great job. And then all of a sudden they find themselves with a team of 5. And the company has not invested early in building an essentials manager capability program. I don't like to use the word manager capability, it's a bit unfair, but defining what great management is. Now, the implications of not defining what great managers should be doing means that people will manage in whatever instinctive ways come to them, which is one of the examples of where you can get out of sync, misaligned with how the values should be expressing themselves. Because one of the ways that the values should be expressing themselves is through the way that people actually manage the people, right? Now, if you don't get it right, what happens is people will ultimately have an experience that is not aligned to the brand. The experience will be inconsistent. And that's because managers are the champions, the advocates, ultimately, of the culture. As a founder is scaling their business, one of the things that they need to be really mindful of is thinking about, okay, do I feel confident that everyone that has manager or has that responsibility in their job, do I feel confident that they are all strong managers, great managers?
Yeah.
If not, pause, growing too quickly and invest the time in building out the capabilities,
Yeah.
the baseline competencies of the managers, and just essentially defining what great management looks like, because it will repay you 100 times over through culture preservation, through delivery on the business plan, and through ultimately the key thing, the engagement of the workforce.
Yeah. And I feel like this is you speaking from experience, because obviously you, after hiring and leading the team that expanded Babylon Health's headcount from 350 to over 1,000 within a year. That's impressive. That's very impressive. So you've obviously got experience with leading teams and being in that management position. And so can you share any sort of key strategies that you found most effective in managing such rapid growth?
Okay, well, let me first of all give a shout out to all of the ex-Babylonians, okay, now known in the UK as EMED. So at that time, it was probably around Q1 2018.
Okay.
And the management team were really focused on accelerating the growth of the business. And one of the strategic business objectives was to essentially penetrate into the US market, because we knew that that's where kind of more revenues would grow, etc. And we needed to accelerate the progress of, you know, each of the milestones on the product roadmap. So we essentially had to recruit a lot more engineers and product people, etc., etc. So at the time, I'm the director of talent acquisition.
Yeah.
And this is before I moved across into the people side. And my first, strategy was about building bandwidth and capacity into the team. So it was about hiring recruiters that had subject matter expertise, and the network to be able to hire at pace. So the metrics that I'm looking at there is time to hire, for example. Now, where recruiters would have the subject matter expertise, for example, or we were using partners like yourself, it was about making sure that we could get the quality of hire. Now, quality of hire is a metric that people talk about it, but they don't really go into the detail of what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? There's lots of kind of philosophical approaches to this. And for us at that time, it was about making sure that we were hiring people who obviously satisfied the requirements of the interview up front, but then looking into the future to see, okay, are these folks passing probation, right? And then beyond that, how are they doing from a performance point of view?
Yeah.
I think one of the learnings when I look back is thinking about, was the environment as such so that they could do their best work, right? Because ultimately, people will not perform if the environment doesn't enable them to do so,
of course.
Right? And I think when you're growing so quickly, to your point before, one of the things that founders need to be mindful of is when you are growing when you are growing and scaling at 25 plus people a month, you want to make sure that your infrastructure is set up to handle that, right? Which leads to the second metric. So this is what talent acquisition professionals, I would say, really kind of learn as a consequence of recruiting quickly, because for the team at the time it was like, hey, we're achieving our targets, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But then when, for example, someone turns up and some of the team didn't know that they were starting that day, and they don't have objectives that have been set by their manager because their manager's overwhelmed with whatever, then ultimately the experience dwindles.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So thinking about okay, what is the infrastructure that you need to build to enable this scale, right? So having the right recruitment ATS and starting to think about okay, where do you automate as much of your processes as possible, right? So Yasar Ahmed, for example, at HelloFresh, he talked about this in one of his podcasts as well, the importance of automating as many of those recruitment workflows as you can means that the talent folks can really focus on giving a world-class experience to the people that are joining, right? It comes back to that question before about the competitive nature of trying to win the best talent, because it is a war for talent, right?
Yeah.
So for us, it was all about making sure that we were really articulating the brand clearly, really defining what is the experience that someone is going to have, trying to put affordable, accessible healthcare into the hands of everyone on the planet, right? That was the model at the time.
Of course, yeah.
Right? And then having the systems where possible that could essentially allow for us to accelerate that hiring in a way that didn't compromise the experience. And just doing the basics well, right? If someone's not successful for an interview, call them up and tell them. The amount of times that people interview for roles and they don't even get feedback, right?
Absolutely.
Like, just putting the human first. And I think these were some of the things that I think in varying quantities we did well, right? Some things we didn't do as well, just keeping it real, right? But I think the team had an incredibly successful run at that time.
And what would you say are some of the best practices or approaches that HR teams can adopt to continually improve the hiring processes and adapt to changing market dynamics?
Ooh, that's a great question. So look, I think it comes down to workforce planning strategy.
Yep. Okay.
Now, there is nothing worse than an exec team come together to make decisions about how they want to grow, and they have not involved the people function, particularly your business partners, right? Mm-hmm. They are there to help you translate that growth plan and that business deliverable into an organizational design that's underpinned with a set of principles, right? What are you prioritizing? What are the trade-offs? How are you managing utilization? How are you managing cash burn, etc., right? Bringing in the talent acquisition leadership early into that conversation to start to think about the scale plan is one of the most important principles that I cannot emphasize enough.
Okay.
What typically sometimes happens is the talent acquisition team get briefed at the nth degree.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Hey, we need you to hire an extra 30, 50 people in 6 months. And then you got that team spinning up, and it's just, if the infrastructure is such where they're just simply, let's say, sending in-mails on LinkedIn to people, that is not a growth strategy, right? You've got to think about a channel and community-based approach, right? Like, how are you building communities of people that are interested and excited about your brand and what they do?
Yeah.
You need to give time to the talent teams to be able to build that up, right?
Build some excitement first.
Right?
Get the name out there.
Right. And then your people partners are then thinking about, okay, cool, like, how are we going to ensure that the experience that people has is aligned to our value proposition?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And everything from, and there's deep philosophical concepts and all of this kind of stuff, but like, when you think about like the organizational design, that really should drive that conversation, right? And bringing folks in early where you can is one of the first steps. The next is thinking about the organizational development, right? So this is all about, okay, what is your talent management strategy? What is your succession plans? Like, what is the implications for the rest of the workforce when you grow it, right? How do you be mindful of, okay, if you hire a bad egg into a critical position, that does sometimes happen, but what's your backup plan, right? Your business partner can help you with that, right? Right through to looking at all of the experience metrics to be able to test that, everything's going as one would expect, right? All of your trend analysis is looking good. And then thinking about the change management. This is one thing I cannot stress enough. When founders sometimes are in a mindset of just super quick growth, they're almost thinking of things through this very programmatic lens. Like, have I done step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4? No. It's about thinking about the human element, right? The change management strategy. How are you going to prepare your organization and the emotions that come with that and the change curves that each person goes through to grow from 100 to 1,000? Because fundamentally, you have a completely different organization at that point.
And it's a lot of work. It's a lot to do, especially for a talent team. And to grow that amount that quickly, it's just, there's so much to go into it. Because it's like you said, you need to create buzz around the product and around the company in order for all of that top talent out there, which it's limited. And, especially the way that the candidate, like the market is at the moment as well, and has been for a little bit of time now, you need to have a bit of buzz in order to grow that team successfully.
Absolutely.
And so, in your experience, what are the most critical elements for a startup to transition successfully from a small team to a larger organization while maintaining core values?
Oh, it's a great question again. So I think there's a couple of things that are really important, right? So I think looking at it through the lens of a people function within a startup, right?
Okay.
I think the first important thing is to really, and I echo this, be clear about how you're going to protect and preserve your culture as you scale, right? If you do not do that, it will be done for you by virtue of the nature of the folks that you hire later on down the line. Because each person will bring their perspective on culture based on what they're used to, right? And then all of a sudden you'll find yourself in a situation where you've got all of these subcultures almost operating amongst. Now, you can accept that there will be a degree of variability in culture based on the different regions that you're in. That is just human nature, that is natural. But I think it's really important to preserve that kind of centralized blueprint, which ultimately is anchored to your values. So it's all about that amplification piece, right? Now, next step is thinking about, okay, how do I actually amplify my values, right?
Yeah.
So it's looking at your process infrastructure. So if you're going after market share in the US or anywhere else, for example, you're thinking really clearly about, is the procedural steps of onboarding, offboarding, you name it, consistent to an extent across all of those regions, for example, right? You're thinking about the capacities of your team to be able to handle those volumes, right? Because if you are scaling, but you've not made the right investments in terms of people to support the scale, then what happens is, as a consequence of going fast, you get burnout, then it costs you later. That's the long tail, right?
Yeah.
So there's that as well. The next piece is thinking about, like, what is the experience that you want people to have across each of these regions? And it's like, how do you measure it, my friend?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So setting up the right kind of systematic approaches to be able to kind of test the temperature across the organization, because that then empowers your people team to help them react and do the trend analysis, right?
Yeah.
The next is what we talked about before, thinking about building those real manager capabilities and muscles throughout the organization. And it's not to say that, managers are not good, but it's thinking about, you will have cohorts of your manager population who are new to the job, for example, have very distinct ways of doing things, or are just simply very unclear about what good looks like for your particular business.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's that piece as well. I think when it comes to the growth plans and how aggressively one grows, it is always this balance between, like, being the one to win the race or innovate within a new space. Because the thing is, every time a company and a founder does a raise, there will be others that are looking to either raise to follow the path or looking to try and take away some of that market share. So you are consistently in that competitive space. So you are, on the one hand, have to be thinking about, like, how aggressively do I grow, and what level of cash burn is actually sustainable for my business, right? Versus, where do you need to spend some money because the benefit will come later on, right? So you'd have to look at things like your systems, your HR systems, your recruitment systems, your analytics tools. You have to think about just basic things like the governance of your data, because you might have an auditor who shows up every 6 months.
Yeah.
Hey, can you show me that your training is effective, please? Well, where can I see the documentation that this person has read and understood this policy? There's some palpitations sometimes with that. So I think there are a set of things that need to be considered.
A lot of things.
Right?
There's a lot to it.
Right? And I think growth should be thoughtful. And growth should be sustainable. I think the hockey stick style growth, we're not seeing that as much anymore because the economy's changed, right?
Okay, yeah.
With the rise of interest rates, for example, we've seen that a lot of the investment community are thinking more about and setting the expectations with founders and management teams that they need to preserve capital and there is a focus on profitability.
Yeah.
Right? You compare that to 5-6 years ago, for example, right? Like you were seeing companies that were listing with some seriously alarming valuations, right? And even with a significant burn rate, like they were still, being able to raise tons of capital, because it was like, well, investment ideology back then was kind of like, well, go after the market share, right?
Yeah.
Win the market, growth at any cost, etc. So we are seeing like a real kind of discipline and focus that requires that founders be really thoughtful about how they grow and how they preserve what they've built so far. Now, here's the thing. For the founders who get it right and make the right set of strategic bets, that will create value like no other in the marketplace. So when it comes back to your first question, which was about how do founders and their company set themselves apart, right? It becomes so much easier when folks can see the success of your business in that trajectory.
Yeah. And kind of leads on to my next question. As Babylon grew significantly, what initiatives were implemented to ensure high employee engagement and satisfaction, and especially with those in different locations and countries?
Yeah.
So that must be hard.
It is extremely hard. And, there's all the kind of dynamics with folks in different regions and how you think about creating that clarity of, delivering on the business plan with OKRs, etc. So I think, look, one of the things that come to mind in terms of what the team did was just thinking about engagement strategies, and first of all, like how you capture that data from across the workforce. So it's not rocket science, right? But one of the engagement listening tools, for example, was one called Peakon that was used.
Okay.
And another one called Culture Amp, right? Now, typically these questions that go to employees at set periods of time can be sent in the form of like a kind of pulse survey that folks respond to regularly, or perhaps where you kind of set a slower and more spread out cadence of questions so that it gives the team time to kind of craft a response to kind of what they're seeing. And the questions are really kind of driven by different kind of psychological concepts, that help to really get under the skin of like what is essentially the NPS score of your population across different regions. Now, typically what an analyst will do, or what a business partner might do, is kind of look at the differences of engagement levels across different specific criteria. So it could be manager support, for example, and thinking about just more generally, where are there specific areas perhaps that an intervention needs to be made? And this is where almost like the research phase kicks in. Now, a founder needs to keep in mind that when it comes to solving for geographical engagement challenges, that is not just the job of the people function.
Yeah.
It is everybody's responsibility.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? So often, sometimes HR teams or people teams, I prefer to call it, fall into that bucket where it's like they're just looked at as the answer to the challenges of the business.
To connect everyone from everywhere.
Right.
It's not just their job.
Absolutely. But what we see is more studies that basically show a more highly engaged workforce translates to greater productivity, which ultimately translates to a greater probability on the delivery of the business plan.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think there's almost like a commercial view here, which is like when an exec and leadership team are all signed up to the vision and the objective of maintaining an engaged workforce, for example, right? The people team partnering the executive team, right, is what ultimately enables the interventions that are required. Now, I think the bottom line is when you apply the principle of like customer centricity into how a people function works, with the sponsorship and backing of exec, and people just feel like, I'm not just being sent nice emails or there's a fluffy initiative here and there, but there's a genuine concern for my well-being. And I feel like my work has a sense of meaning and purpose, and I have the tools required to do a great job, and there are the opportunities for me to grow and learn in my career. I tell you, that combination, man.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic combination. And I think really what I always say to my teams, like, you know, the people team, the talent team, we're almost like experimenting and testing all the time, right? To see what initiatives work, what initiatives are short versus long-term focus points, for example, and then how are we using the data to translate that into action plans, right? Where people feel like the people team are really doing something.
Yeah, absolutely. There is it's a lot more to. There's a lot more to it, obviously, with the people teams. There's a lot of responsibilities that people think that lies with the people team, but it doesn't. Sometimes there are certain things when it comes to the people of the business that not only the people team can deal with, and it does just go beyond that team, doesn't it? And it goes to the founders and the leadership teams, and it is a collective thing that you need to do and strategize together in order to create that culture and retain top talent, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Especially if it's global and there's all these different teams in all these different countries. It can't just resolve down to one team to keep those teams together, can it? And finally, just to wrap up this lovely conversation, what would you say would be a key bit of advice to founders who are just starting to build their team that you would give to somebody now, or wish you would have known when you started your career? What's your key bit of advice that you could give to the people out there?
I'll probably start with saying that it's about the mindset with which they approach growing businesses with people in them. So people are not numbers.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Right. And I think sometimes founders can fall into a very transactional mindset when it comes to change or growth or hiring, etc. I think they should try to think more of growing their business like an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right? One thing affects something else that could result in 1,000,001 different potential outcomes. And I think being really clear on the trade-offs of their decisions means that a decision is informed. There is nothing worse than making a decision versus being forced to make a decision.
Yeah.
And we've seen that a lot with the rise and fall of different businesses, right? Because circumstances have changed, right? I think what the founder should do is surround themselves with people and skill sets that complement their strengths and areas of growth as well, and have a management team that are encouraged to tell the truth, right? I think sometimes what happens is in stressful environments where, you are under pressure to grow, right? People can embellish and be very positive about what the outlook looks like, right? And actually what you want to do is encourage a team to have psychological safety, to be able to say it as it is. And not psychological safety just amongst peers, but upward and downward throughout the hierarchy of the organization, right? I think founders want to think about having more agile focused teams, right? Because what they'll find is that as time goes on, they may not have enough organizational layers within their business to promote everyone each year.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's about, okay, how do we create internal experiences for people where they constantly feel that sense of growth as well? I think I would invest early in building out the right systems and infrastructure and capabilities in that sense, because I think that's thought of too late. I would think about what metrics are important to them to measure success. I would encourage them to utilize the investor network. So whichever investors have backed them, utilize those networks to be in a position where ultimately they can leverage talent, from the organizations as well. And I think the final one would probably be a classic piece, which is experiment quickly, but fail quickly as well.
Yeah.
Right? If something is not working, don't be afraid to stop doing it. Right? fail fast would
Yeah.
be the principle I would suggest.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And there you have it. That's some really great bit of advice. But that is the end of this podcast. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dean. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I wish you the best of luck with your future endeavours and everything that you do in your career.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Pleasure. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Vision to Venture. If you're listening, make sure to give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching, like and subscribe to listen to more inspiring stories from leaders in the tech space.